Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Jeff Badnock, and on behalf of our organizing committee, our amazing Alumni Association staff, and our lecturers, I'm proud and happy to welcome you to the second lecture of the 20th Annual Alumni Association Community Lecture Series. The series was developed as a means to showcase University of Montana's amazing faculty and the very, very interesting work that they're doing on campus. The series we've selected this year is Beyond the Headlines, Clearing the Air with Real Evidence. Our first three lectures are going to focus on the topic of wildfire. There's a great interest in wildfire for those of us in Western Montana. And we're endeavoring to educate us all about wildfire. And then the fourth and fifth lecture will be about understanding what is true. And we all get besieged by information day in and day out, and learning how to discern that which is true from that which is not. We're going to learn about that. And then our sixth and final lecture will be a panel of all of our lecturers, followed by a reception. I hope you'll all plan to come to. It'll give you an opportunity outside of the lecture classroom arrangement to talk one-on-one with the lecturers. If you have something that has piqued your interest over the course of the lectures and you want to take it up with one of our lecturers one-on-one, that will be the time to do it over a glass of wine or a beer. Does anyone need to be reminded about silencing their phone? Because if you do, now's the time to do it. Our series began with lectures last week by Professor Andrew Larson and Professor Anna Sala that talked about the nature of wildfire and our forests and what causes wildfire and what to expect from wildfire. Tonight, Professor Philip I'm sorry, I don't want to mess your name up. Higuera, thank you. With a name like mine, I'm very sensitive to that. Is going to speak to us tonight about the history of wildfire, not just what happened last year, but deep history. What has been the history of wildfire in this area and in America, and what we can expect, and what that means for our future, and what we can expect to confront in the future. Please join me in welcoming Professor Philip Higuera for tonight's lecture.
All right, just going to reset that so I can keep the time. Volume good in the back? Okay. I want to start by thanking the organizers for the invitation to speak tonight. I'm definitely honored to be part of this series, and thank you all for coming out tonight. And I look forward to continuing on this theme of the inevitability of wildfire. And tonight I'm going to share with you some of my research and the perspective that gives me and gives scientists when we wrestle with thinking about living with wildfire here in Western Montana. So here's the prettiest picture I could find of the Lolo Peak fire from last summer. And, you know, this is really what motivates a lot of the discussion that I'm going to talk about tonight. And I'm going to weave in and out of research that's going to get pretty far away from this, but in the end I'm going to be coming back to thinking about how we respond to and think about fires in our backyard. So I'm going to start here with a quotation from Winston Churchill that was spoken, of course, in the context of politics and human systems. That's the longer you can look back, the further you can look forward. Churchill and others, of course, and historians in general, recognize the importance of being able to interpret our present and anticipate our future in the context of understanding the past. So it's true for political systems, social systems, and it's true for ecosystems and physical systems as well. So with that in mind, and with the 20th anniversary of this series in mind, I thought I'd start with a brief introduction of how I got into wildfire and what kind of motivates my curiosity and passion over this subject. So the series started 20 years ago, and I took that opportunity to think back what I was doing 20 years ago. 20 years ago, I was freshly minted out of undergraduate. I was a biology major, and I was lucky to be able to go to Alaska and work for my mentor in Alaska studying tree line. And I don't know if any of you folks know MPG Ranch, which is down the way a little bit. This is Kate Schick, Rose now, who was also part of that trip, who's a great bird biologist down there. So in 1998, I was able to work with my undergraduate advisor, and we were in Alaska studying tree line change. And this experience had a big impact on me because it was the first time where I appreciated that when you look out on a landscape and you look at a forest or any ecosystem, what you see today is not what that landscape looked like 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 100 years ago. And the flip side of that is it's not what that landscape's going to look like in the future as well. Of course, we were in Alaska, which is renowned for being an extremely wild place. So you could think of the human footprint being relatively low. But the reason we were studying these things in Alaska is because northern high latitudes were and still are one of the places on the planet that are experiencing climate change at a much faster rate than the globe on average. It's warming at about twice the rate as the globe on average. And today I'm looking at the headlines seeing stories about above freezing temperatures over the North Pole and areas where sea ice has melted for the first time in a long time. So we were studying forest change in the context of this. And while we were up there, one of my mentors made the comment, what we really need to understand? We need to understand fire history up here. And I hadn't thought about fire history much at that point. But ever since then, I have been studying forests and non-forest ecosystems and the relationship between environmental change, including climate change, human activity, and wildfires and vegetation. So this is the cover of National Geographic in 2004. This was in the middle of my dissertation, which focused on fire history up in Alaska. I've been really lucky since 1998 to study fire in many different ecosystems. And as you'll learn in this lecture, my work does not involve going to active fires, but fire is such a component of forest ecosystems that I have acquired a series of photos of active fires just in the process of going and doing field work, which, as you'll see, is ultimately going to depend on lakes. So these are some active fires in boreal forests in Alaska. This is a tundra wildfire. And basically, this works well for field work because the conditions are nice and warm, but in all these cases, at the end of field work, a little lightning storm has come through and wildfires ignite. So in addition to Alaska, I've worked in the Rocky Mountains, and I've recreated a lot in the Rocky Mountains, which I know most of you have too. And if you've recreated in the Rocky Mountains, you know that it's difficult to go out into any forest and not see signs of past wildfires. So whether it's for work or recreation, I've also been fascinated by thinking about scenes like this, trying to understand how often fires occur in these systems, what type of impact fires have on these systems, and how long it will take forests like this to recover. So I'll end with this slide here from the Bitterroot National Forest just down the road in 2006. This is the Gash Creek fire. This is a fire that I ended up a decade later now taking my fire ecology class to study. So big picture, to me, wildfires are a really fascinating impact on natural ecosystems, and I think they drive home the importance of long timescales in terms of understanding the landscape that we're in. So for this talk, I'm going to divide the talk up into two sections. The first part of the talk, I'm going to focus on fire history, as the title suggests, and broadly I'm going to use the past as a way to understand our present and the future. So a lot of my work, I use the past essentially as a natural experiment. If we want to understand how fire responds to climate change, to human activity, one of the best ways to study that is to look at how it's responded to changes in the past. Then the second part of the talk, I'm going to think about the future of fire and share some of the current scientific understanding about what we expect to see with wildfires in the future, both Montana, Western US, and globally a little bit. So to start off here, why do we study the past? Why might we want to study the past? Well, I'm going to highlight 3 reasons why studying the past in the context of wildfire and ecology in general is particularly important. The first is that studying the past provides us a very important perspective that we would not get otherwise. So that's a view or outlook that we would otherwise not know. The second is that it provides context for ongoing change. So understanding the past provides context for understanding why the Lolo Peak fire burned, what will happen after that. And then what largely motivates my research is the goal of gaining ecological insight, understanding how ecosystems work. And again, we do that by understanding how they've changed over time. So let's start with perspective. And I'm going to cheat a little bit here because this is really only 10 years worth of time. But what this highlights is how your perspective, in this case a global perspective, can inform your understanding of a process, in this case wildfire. So this is a compilation of satellite data, and what you're seeing are the seasons through about 10 years. You can see snow cover going in and out of the northern hemisphere. The green is vegetation growth, so going in northern and southern hemisphere summers. And then the red are wildfires, both human set and natural ignitions. What's compelling to me about this image is that you see fire as part of the Earth system. You see fire occurring just with the seasons. Every time there's vegetation that grows and then there are seasonal conditions that dry out the vegetation, you have wildfire occurrence. We can likewise think about our perspective in time. If we think about the history of fire in the context of our planet is, our best estimate currently is 4.5 billion years old. Pretty much as soon as we have vegetation on the land and enough oxygen in the atmosphere to support combustion, we have evidence of fire. So that currently dates back to about 420 million years. So fire has been a long-standing process on the Earth. Over this time period, many of the plants that we know have evolved, and we ourselves, humans, have evolved. So we come on the scene here about 6 million years ago. About 400,000 years ago is when we figure out how to use fire for our own purposes. That's for cooking. And then around 50,000 years ago, humans figure out how to use fire to change forage and use it to help in hunting, and then 10,000 years ago for agriculture. So what this perspective kind of drives home is that fire is a long-standing natural process on the planet, present throughout the evolution of many organisms, plants, animals, ourselves. So that perspective in itself at least prevents us from seeing wildfire only as a disaster. And so I want to just highlight here one of the reasons that fire is such an interesting topic, scientifically, socially, is that it spans this spectrum. Right? On your left, I've just told you that fire has been part of the Earth for 420 million years. It's wholly a natural phenomenon. But on the right, we know that when fires burn our houses and when fires take human lives, it is a disaster. So fire can be, it's a natural phenomenon. It can be a human disaster when it interacts with the things that we value. Okay, so that's an important perspective. Next two motivations, context and ecological insight. So this summer when Missoula was filled with smoke and reporters started calling to get some sort of information on what was going on, these were the three questions, more or less, that I was asked the most. Is this normal or is this abnormal? What's going to happen? Are our forests destroyed or devastated? And why is this happening? Is it because fill in the blank? Right? These questions are all really important questions to ask when wildfires occur. If we rephrase these a little bit in the context of a scientific research proposal, these are broadly those same questions, and these are broadly the questions that I've been addressing with colleagues and with students in my lab over a number of years. How often does an area burn? How does fire affect ecosystems? How does it affect vegetation? How does it affect carbon, nitrogen? How long does it take for an ecosystem to recover after a wildfire? And probably most importantly, or synthetically, how does this vary with climate variability and climate change, with vegetation change, and with human activity? So I'm going to use the most current project in my lab. So it's the one I'm most excited about. We're calling the Big Burns Project. So a lot of my work, I noted, has taken place in Alaska and across the Rockies. I'm very excited to have some work starting here in our backyard. I'm going to use this Big Burns Project, which is a project funded by the National Science Foundation, asking these questions broadly in the southern Rockies and in the northern Rockies, up here in the area burned by the fires in 1910, up along the Idaho-Montana divide. The photos here are all of lakes. So when we ask these questions, we want to understand how ecosystems change over time. What we're going to talk about next is using lake sediments to reconstruct past environments and using lake sediments to reconstruct past fire history. So this is the way that we gain insight into these questions. So transition here, how do we study the past? Much of my work relies on lake sediments. We do a little bit of work with tree rings as well. And tree rings, I'm going to put a little pitch in at the end because they're a critical tool that have informed our understanding and what I'm going to communicate tonight. So if we think of the past as a series of natural experiments, we can think of lakes as kind of like the notebook where the results of those experiments have been recorded. We like lakes because generally they're passive recorders of what's happened in the environment. So this is a photo of Missoula Lake up in the Lolo National Forest. And it's a pretty shot. Every year here, as trees produce pollen and other plants produce pollen, excuse me, and trees lose some of their needles every year, that material is deposited onto the lake surface. It gets waterlogged, falls to the bottom of the lake, and because there's little or no oxygen in the sediment at the bottom of that lake, that material is preserved for thousands of years. So we can go and pull out a needle from 6,000 years ago, and it will look more or less like the needle that you'd pick up off the forest floor. So lakes are kind of little time capsules that lock up what's happened. So we can use pollen and macrofossils or needles to reconstruct and understand how forests have changed over time. And then, of course, we can also use charcoal. So these are big pieces of charcoal, macroscopic charcoal, to reconstruct when fires have burned around the lake. So this site happened to burn in 1910, and we'll see through this study, but we expect that there would be a signal of charcoal in the lake sediment record after the 1910 fire, as we see in other areas. So these proxies tell us what's going on in the watershed around this lake. And as you'll see, we can then get this information from multiple lakes and an individual lake going back thousands of years. So the way we do this is all by coring manually. So this is our two little rubber rafts, and we have a hand-driven piston corer. This field work's a lot of fun. Here, unfortunately, we went to core the first lake in our study area. The seasons had changed, so now we're dressed a little bit more warmly. So this is the northernmost lake in our study area, Silver Lake. And this is the topmost sediment in the lake. So this is actually the water at the bottom of the lake. This lake is about 18 meters deep. So we're using rods to lower this down. Through 18 meters, this is the top sediment, the most recently deposited. You might be able to see this in the back, but there's a little gray stripe there. That's an ash layer from 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens. So we like ashes because those are free dates. Otherwise, we use radiocarbon dating, and each radiocarbon date costs a couple $100. So this is a good part of the world to do this work because we get some free dates. 7 or 8 meters lower in this lake, this is where we ended. This right here, so the top is to your left, the bottom's to your right. This right here is the Mazama ash layer. So how many people have been to Crater Lake National Park? Okay, so you guys, I'm sure you read the interpretive information and you know that Crater Lake was formed when Mount Mazama erupted 7,700 years ago. The plume from Mount Mazama, it collapsed pretty much right over northern Idaho and western Montana. So if anybody was around during the 1980 St. Helens eruption and you got some ash on your car or something, this is about 1 centimeter. This is probably going to be 1 meter deep here, but we stopped coring because it's difficult to get through. So in some lakes up here, you can get 1 meter of ash from the eruption of Mount Mazama. So we also know now that we've gotten down to 7,700 years old. So we take these cores, we take them back to the lab. This is Kira Wolf, a graduate student in the lab who's working up the Silver Lake core. We split them, open them up. We can see the stratigraphy, the layers. Kira here is slicing the core into 0.5 centimeter intervals. And then in each one of those intervals, that's a little picture into what was going on in the past. So we can look at these proxies, the charcoal, pollen, and macrofossils, and get an inference into the vegetation and fire history in the past. So this is one core. These are all the cores we collected from Silver Lake. So we get a continuous record from the top to the bottom. And basically, we work up a series of time series that tell us how different components of the environment have changed over time. So I'm going to show you how we infer fire history from macroscopic charcoal from these lakes. So here is an example from a master's student who worked in the lab a couple of years ago, Paul Dennett. This is a lake in Rocky Mountain National Park. So the present is on your right. This goes back to about 4,200 years before present. And the y-axis is the accumulation rate of charcoal. So this is charcoal pieces falling on the bottom of the lake. And what you can see is that there's highly variable, and there are these spikes every once in a while. We can compare the most recent known fire. In this case, it was reconstructed with tree rings in 1782. We can compare that to the charcoal record, and it corresponds here to this large peak. And basically, the peaks above that red line we interpret as past fire events. So this is a look at fire history in one watershed in a subalpine forest in Rocky Mountain National Park over the last 4,200 years. So I'll be coming back to this record and some of the insights that we've gained from records like this in a bit. Last thing I'm going to add here is the kind of tip of the hat and brief breeze through tree ring records for fire history. So tree ring records are extremely useful for reconstructing fire history as well. They work a little bit differently. In fires that don't kill trees, they can scar a portion of the tree, and an individual tree can survive multiple fires. So what you see on your left here is a section of a tree. You're looking down on it. This tree is burned dozens of times. Because trees typically put on an annual ring or a ring every year, we can get precise dates of these fires. And what you're looking at on your right then, each horizontal line here is one tree, and the tick marks in here are fire scars on the individual tree. This is a watershed, Baker, and you can see all the trees in this watershed and when they burned. So you can see some years most trees burned. This was a large fire. You can also see that after the turn of the last century, not so many fires. So that tree rings, particularly fire scars, are one of the best records we have for documenting the impact of fire suppression. This is work done by Emily Heyerdahl, who's a fire ecologist and forest ecologist out at the fire lab, the Forest Service Fire Lab. Will also return to one of her studies. Okay, so what have we learned? This will breeze through about how we learn about the past. What have we learned? I'm going to highlight 3 key things. The first is that ecosystems are dynamic. This seems like a no-brainer, but I like to start with the most no-brainer point. Ecosystems are dynamic, they change over time, and paleo records show that very well. Second point I'm going to emphasize here is that in fire-prone ecosystems, ecosystems that have burned in the past, we see that they recover from wildfires. So they're not devastated. And then the last point, through multiple records and over multiple timescales, we see very strong links between fire activity and climate variability. So fire and climate have been very tightly linked in the past. So first point, ecosystems are dynamic, and we understand the mechanisms leading to this dynamism. Largely, ecosystems are dynamic due to the direct and indirect impacts of climate. So this simple schematic has framed a lot of the work in my career, for better or for worse. But climate can drive fire activity directly through the ways that are intuitive to us. If it's warm and dry, we're going to get more fire. But when we look at records over longer timescales, we also see that climate can drive fire activity indirectly through changing ecosystem properties, and in particular, when climate drives changes in vegetation over decades to centuries, those changes in vegetation can be a very important driver of fire activity. Okay, so let's look at some evidence highlighting the dynamism of ecosystems. This is a record from Puget Lowland forests in Washington. So these are the forests that are dominated by big old Douglas fir, or at least were. There are very few of these systems left. And this record goes back from, this is the present on your right, goes back, I think, 10,000 years-ish here. At the top, you're looking at a representation of the pollen data from sediment core. And at the simplest level, what I want you to see is that lines are wiggling, right? Things are varying. I'm drawing your attention to 2 important species, tree species in these forests, western red cedar and western hemlock. And in the case of western Washington, as we go back in time here, we see that prior to the eruption of Mount Mazama, actually, or a little bit before, about 8,000 years ago, these 2 species were not on the landscape. Okay? So palynologists divide up these pollen diagrams into zones, and I'm highlighting up here. This is zone 3, zone 2. There's a tiny zone 1 here. If we go back further in time, we'd see a couple other zones here that basically start once glaciers receded from this area. So in the post-glacial history of Western North America, almost any point where we stand, so we could do this nearby as well, any point that we stand, we're going to see that the system has supported pretty diverse vegetation types, very different forest ecosystems, in some cases with species assemblages that we don't see today. And what this highlights in general is that forest vegetation is dynamic and it's largely responding to climate change. This last period here, zone 1, that's brought to you by logging in the late 1800s. So this also highlights kind of the impact that humans can have on ecosystems. So post-logging, the blue increases, which is alder. So alder increases at the expense of the conifers. On the bottom here, you're looking at charcoal accumulation, and this is highlighting fire occurrence and how fire occurrence varies over time. And I won't dive into the details, but basically the fire activity at this site is responding both to climate change and to these different forest types. So the fuel structure back here in this period is very different than the more modern forest that we see over the past several thousand years. So ecosystems are dynamic over time. both with respect to fire and vegetation. I'll highlight the fire part again. This is the record we looked at earlier from Rocky Mountain National Park. And here I just want to point out that if you look at the spacing between those red dots, so that tells us, the frequency of those red dots is fire frequency. Another way that we think about fire is with the return interval, how long it is between any two fires. So fire visited this lodgepole pine forest once every 20 to 330 years. So point there is that's really variable. It makes it hard to say, the average of 122 years, makes it hard to plan around an average of 122 years. That average doesn't mean very much, no pun intended, because 20 to 330 years. I also want to point out that here's our average human lifespan. So you can place yourself anywhere in here, and your interpretation or understanding of the system could be quite different. Right? So from the perspective of a human lifespan, this system doesn't burn very often. But when you look at it over the duration of this forest, and it was lodgepole pine forest this entire time, you can see that, in fact, fire is very much a part of this system. All right, the second point I want to make here that we've learned from long-term records is that these fires, they do have pronounced impacts on ecosystems. I'm showing one piece of evidence here. This is from that same lake sediment record. If we look at some proxies of, in this case, productivity, high values are representing high productivity in the forest. Low values are representing low productivity in the forest and high productivity in the lake. What we see is after these high severity fires in particular, see the system goes into a very different state, low forest productivity as you'd expect, and then this climbs back up to near zero values here. And this is just an anomaly, so the units don't mean anything in and of themselves. So fire is a big kick to these lodgepole pine ecosystems. What's interesting is that we can see, because this forest was dominated by lodgepole pine the whole time, we can see that it recovers. And this is that same variable. So we see lots of variability in this carbon to nitrogen ratio. A lot of it's related to the high severity fires, which are highlighted by the red lines. But these lines, they don't crash. They don't go off in one direction and go out of control. So fire has pronounced impacts on ecosystems, but ecosystems are largely resilient to repeated wildfire activity. Okay? So this is an example from lodgepole pine forest in Rocky Mountain National Park. I'm going to cheat a little bit and come back closer to the present, something that's probably more familiar to us. We see the same thing after wildfires in our lifespan. Here's a satellite photo of Yellowstone National Park in 1989, the year after the 88 fires. And you can see these dark areas are areas that burned in 88. And then here's the same perspective 20 years later. You can still see where the fires were, but largely you can see that these ecosystems are on their way to recovery. So we know this from modern studies, for example, in Yellowstone. But what lake sediment records show us is that these patterns in these forests can sustain wildfires for thousands of years. Okay, so my third point here from what we've learned is that fire and climate have been tightly linked over multiple timescales. I'm going to start with an example that keeps us in Yellowstone National Park. So this is just the central part of Yellowstone, and this is a study that builds on a tree ring reconstruction of fire history. We've added lake sediment records to this study. So first I'm going to show you the reconstruction of area burned. So the y-axis here is area burned, and on the x-axis here we have time. This time we're only going back about 750 years here. And our units have changed, so now we're in year AD, what we're more familiar with. And this record goes up just before the 1988 fires. So I've added in 1988. This is how much area burned in the study area in 1988. So when we go back in time, this is the tree ring record, the light gray, and the black is the charcoal inferred, or the charcoal record that we use to reconstruct area burned. So you can see variability over time. You can see that 1988 is not alone there. When we look at paleoclimate records over this time period, we also see that years with unusually dry conditions, these are the 10 driest years, they correspond with above average area burned. So again, this is fairly intuitive, but it's nice when we can discover and support this stuff with evidence. Area burned is higher in this subalpine forest during years with warm, dry conditions. Okay, so that's Yellowstone over the past, or I should add here too, the record doesn't go up here, but you guys are well aware that 1988 was a warm, dry year. So that's Yellowstone National Park. Let's expand out and look at the Northern Rockies over a slightly shorter time period. Actually, this is a longer time period, 1650 to 1900. So this is a study led by Emily Herdahl using fire-scarred tree ring records in our neck of the woods here. So these red dots are sites where there are records similar to the one that I showed you. So this is hundreds of trees going into this. And what Emily and colleagues did was quantify how many sites in that record burned in each year going back to 1600. So the y-axis here is the number of sites that have evidence of a fire that burned a portion of their study site. So again, you can see variability over time. And in this study, they used the threshold of 5 sites here as the definition. When more than 5 sites burn, they called that a regional fire year. So this is very much like what we just went through. We just experienced a regional fire year. It wasn't just that Lolo Peak was burning. There was Lolo Peak, there was Rice Ridge, there were fires further north, there were fires in Idaho. So regional fire year is when there are multiple fire events going around. So these regional fire years here, there were 32 years in their record with more than, the record itself is 251 years old, or 251 years. 32 of those years were regional fire years, so 13%. 120 of those years, or 48%, were just local fire years. So there was evidence of fire, but it wasn't everywhere. And then 99 years, there was no fire in these sites, so about 40%. So this is the minority of years. When you look at the climate conditions during those years, this is what we see. So the top panel here is a temperature reconstruction. So it's expressed on the y-axis there, temperature anomaly, warmer than average, cooler than average. Lots of wiggles in there. The triangles are those regional fire years. So you can ask yourself whether those triangles are evenly distributed above and below, or whether they're kind of piled up in the warm years. You can do the same thing here with this drought index. Here this is reversed, so this drought index, low values correspond to drought. And you can see that most of the triangles are occurring during dry years. So statistically, there's a very clear pattern here. Regional fire years are associated with warmer, drier summer conditions than average. So that's some of the evidence that we call upon when we talk about the links between climate and fire. So we've looked at lake sediment records extending back 750 years, tree ring records extending back to the year 1600. We can zoom in now to the last century. So this is a study that I led with Penny Morgan, who's one of the authors on that last study. So this is looking at pretty much the same study region here, Northern Rockies, but this is using a fire atlas, so the spatial coverage is more extensive. So this is what burning looked like in the Northern Rockies over the last 100+ years. And you can see this very interesting U-shaped pattern A lot of people have discussed this and have hypotheses as to why that is. There are probably multiple reasons, but what I'm going to highlight here and what we report in this study is that a lot of that variability can be explained simply by climate variability alone. So this is spring temperatures, March through May. GDD is growing degree days. If you're a gardener or a farmer, you know what those are. The accumulation of heat over a year. Red means warm, blue means cool. So this middle portion of the 20th century where we had little fire activity in the Northern Rockies, a lot of people attribute that to successful fire suppression. I'm not doubting that fire suppression was successful then, but it was also helped a lot by cooler temperatures than particularly the last several decades. So this link between fire and climate, we see it in the tree ring record, we see it in the 20th century in the observational record as well. Zooming out to the western US, one final study here. This is a study that combines information from tree ring records and lake sediment records across the entire western US. So these little triangles are fire scar sites. So you guys get an idea of the scope of this type of research. One of the great things about paleo work is that the community shares information, and this allows these large summaries to happen. The blue circles here, or the circles, are lake sediment records. And cutting to the chase from this paper, what these authors show that, so here we are year CE now, same thing as AD, back to the year 600. They could predict fire activity, which is this red line. They could predict that pretty well with temperature and drought metrics. And their prediction is in this dashed black line. And what I want you to note is that that prediction follows the red line pretty well until about the early 1900s. Then the predicted area burn goes up, and their reconstructed area burn goes down. So this is interpreted as this is the human footprint and the impact of fire suppression across the West. And this difference here is what they term the fire deficit. So meaning if climate alone was driving this pattern, we would expect the line to be up here, but this is what we see. So climate has been a significant driver of fire activity, but Euro-Americans in particular have had important impacts on fire activity as well. That's not to say that fire and climate are no longer linked. So fire and climate have been tightly linked, and they still are, even with all of the impacts that humans have on fire activity. This is a correlation between fuel aridity, which is a climate metric, represents the dryness of fuels. And on the y-axis, this is area burned in forests across the western US. So this is an impressive relationship for an ecologist. About 76% of the variability in forest fire area is explained by the variability in fuel aridity. So this is over the past several decades, from 1984 to 2015. And then what you also see in here is that this period, the 21st century versus the late 20th century, the red dots you can see are all piled up here. This is the increase in area burn that we're experiencing in the western US, and it corresponds to greater fuel aridity. Okay, so to wrap up here, what have we learned? Ecosystems are dynamic, due largely to climate variability and climate change. Fire has pronounced impacts on ecosystems, but ecosystems recover. So the paleo record shows time and again that fire-prone ecosystems can sustain burning over millennia. And then finally, fire activity has been tightly linked to climate variability and climate change over multiple timescales, from the past several decades to the past several thousand years. All right, so that's what we've learned. briefly here, what can we expect for the future and what can we do? So what can we expect in the future? This shouldn't be a shocker, right? Climate change is and likely will increase the likelihood of wildfires. Right? Something else that we should expect in the future is that our ecosystems are going to start to reorganize in response to climate and wildfire. So I want to bring your attention, if you guys aren't aware of the Montana Climate Assessment. This is a report led by researchers at both MSU and U of M. It was released last fall. This gives the most current information about what we expect for climate in this state. I started by showing you increased temperatures in Fairbanks, Alaska. We see increased temperatures across the state of Montana as well since 1950. What are our expectations? This is very similar to other locations in the Northern Hemisphere and the globe. We expect temperatures to increase under different climate scenarios by values that are big deal. 4.5 to 6 degrees Fahrenheit by mid-century, 5.6 to 9.8 degrees Fahrenheit by the end of the century. We have high confidence in both of those statements. There's high agreement and robust evidence supporting those. When it comes to precipitation, it's a little bit trickier. Predictions of precipitation are inherently more difficult. But we expect precipitation to decrease in the summer and increase in the other seasons. So that has moderate agreement and moderate evidence. You add that up, and that means more fire-conducive conditions. So warmer, drier summers, based on what I just showed you, the patterns that we see in the past, we would expect that to lead to more fire activity. And indeed, when we put this into statistical models, what we see, here I'm saying Montana is not going to be alone. Right? Wildfire activity is expected to increase across much of the globe. So these are two graphics playing out the scenarios of climate change with those statistical relationships between climate and wildfire. On your left is the mid-century, or now to 2039. On your right is mid to late century. And the red colors are areas where there's agreement that fire activity is going to increase. There's going to be more frequent fire or more area burned, either way you like to think about it. And what you can see is on the right, most of the globe, over 50%, is projected to experience increased fire activity. Interesting reasons why there's blue there. We can talk about that later. All right. In the western US, we're already starting to see this happen. Right? So over the past several decades, since the late 70s, we've seen literally a stepwise increase in area burned by large wildfires. This is well linked, as I showed, to increases in fuel aridity. So warmer, drier summers, earlier springs. The other impressive statistic associated with this to me is the increase in fire season. So across the entire western US, these are the numbers. When we look at the Northern Rockies in particular, Northern Rockies are driving a lot of these trends or contributing more than other regions. So in the Northern Rockies, the length of our fire season has almost tripled from the 70s to early 80s up until the most recent decade. So things are already changing, and this is more or less what we expect to see if you turn up the temperature or aridity knob. The question that I got a lot this summer was, is this climate change? And the answer is, we can't attribute any one summer to climate change or any one wildfire to climate change. But 2 falls ago now, or in 2016, this paper came out. This is one of the first papers that starts to attribute or trying to parse out the contribution of human-caused climate change from natural variability and the impact that that has on fire activity. And what this study highlights is that about half of the increase in area burned can be attributed to human-caused climate change. So this red line is the observed area burned as predicted by their statistical model. This black line is what you would predict if you took out the contributions of greenhouse gases from fossil fuel combustion and other human activities and this yellow line here is the difference. So although fire is natural, we see large areas burn in the past, we're starting to be able to diagnose the human fingerprint on the increased fire activity in the last several decades. Did I go back? I did. Okay. So the second thing I was highlighting is that ecosystems are going to reorganize. This is a study that came out just this year. Myself and colleagues, we combined a bunch of information from a dozen studies. And what we highlight in this study is that we're already starting to see lower tree regeneration after wildfires, and that this is likely due to those warmer, drier conditions. So the warmer, drier conditions that lead to more wildfire activity, somewhat intuitively, that also makes it more difficult for trees to reestablish after wildfires because they're more moisture stressed. So in this study, we looked at about 1,500 sites across 52 wildfires in 5 states, in largely the Northern Rockies plus Colorado, that burned in fires between 1988 and 2011. And what we found, kind of just coincident with this change in shift in climate. So this is a moisture deficit, warm, dry up here, cool, wet down here. This is the climate data for those sites. You can see that the 21st century has been warmer and drier than the late 20th century. What we found over that time period is that post-fire climate, the climate conditions in the first 3 to 5 years after a wildfire have shifted. So this is before 2000, after 2000, higher moisture stress. So these seedlings, these sites are experiencing higher moisture stress, and that corresponds to decreased seedling density. And in particular, look at this bin that has zeros. The number of sites with zeros is almost doubled from, say, 17% to just over 30%. An important unknown in our predictions of the future, it's pretty clear that climate conditions are going to be more fire conducive. One of the important unknowns is how feedbacks between fire, vegetation, and fire are going to play out. So we can intuit that if we burn up all of the trees and they don't grow back, that at some point we're going to run out of fuel to burn. So the important unknown is at what point will a lack of fuel limit future burning despite fire conducive conditions? That might be like the most positive thing that I can call on in terms of maybe moderating a fiery future. Okay, what can we do? And note, this is not what should we do. This is what can we do. Keep pressing back. Okay. So we can plan for the inevitability of wildfires based on our best scientific understanding of fire as a process and our understanding of human natural systems. We can do that. Whether we should do that is up for our discussion. In this last section, in the last few minutes here, I want to highlight some take-home messages from a paper that came out last year where the title really answers this question, what can we do? And this is what these authors, I'm not included in this, think we should do. I was going to have my hat here. So when I put on my hat, then I'm just talking as a citizen. So as a scientifically informed citizen, I largely agree with these as what we should do. But the title of this paper is Adapt to More Wildfire in Western North America as Forests and Climate Change. The plot on the right here is kind of sobering. Western US, the black areas here, these are areas where there were fuels treatments put in on public lands. So some vegetation management intended to modify fire behavior. Fuels treatments are effective at modifying fire behavior. They're not intended nor are they effective at eliminating fire. That's not their goal. But over this time period, So 2005, 2014, these are the other colors, areas that have burned. And 2004, 2013, these are fuels treatments that were burned. So the main point here is that the black bar is tiny compared to the pinkish orange bar, right? So much more of our landscape is being impacted by wildfire than we could reasonably expect to treat. So fuel treatments are important locally, but it's really unlikely that we're going to be able to use fuel treatments to alter regional fire trends. And by regional fire trends, I mean the increase in fire activity, for example, that we've seen in the Northern Rockies over the past several decades. The other take-home here is that wildfire is going to be the dominant treatment on our landscape, federal or otherwise. So that's really what drives home the titles of these two talks. Fire is inevitable. Here's some of the key suggestions out of this table that I'm going to skip through. So what can we do? Plan for wildfire. Some of the suggestions: reduce fire suppression where possible. Recognize that fire is going to happen out there, and recognize the value that fire can have in terms of meeting many management objectives. So fire is an excellent fuels treatment. So if conditions are not extreme, like last summer, let fire burn if that's possible. Target fuels treatments near homes and communities. That's where they're going to be most effective, and that's largely what they're intended for. Promote fire-adapted construction and planning. That's not easy, but that's a suggestion. Embrace shifts in ecosystems due to changing climate and fire. So also not easy, but one of the take-homes I'm trying to get here is that systems have changed, systems are going to change, and we have a choice of whether we resist it or understand how things are going to change or how things might change, and embrace or at least accept. And then the last one here, foster an understanding of the role of fire on the landscape. And at the simplest level, if you leave here with one thing, fire in itself is not a disaster. It plays an important role in the ecosystems, and in a lot of ways it can do things that are consistent with what humans want out of landscapes. So to close here, I'm going to put up a quotation from a colleague of mine and my PhD advisor, Linda Brubaker. This is in the context of a restoration ecology textbook, but I think it's fitting here as well. The lessons implied from PaleoEcology, or studying the past, suggest that making friends with physical and ecological change is an important prerequisite to effective stewardship. I think we could replace the last part, effective stewardship, with being responsible citizens. So I like this idea of making friends with physical and ecological change. And with that, we'll leave you with that idea. Thank you for coming tonight. As with any of this stuff, there are lots of people that contribute to this work. I want to thank the lab and many of my collaborators. And I hope we have some time for some questions. Thanks.
Before we get started on the question and answer, I want to take 30 seconds. Joe, where are you? One of the prescriptions that Professor Higuera gave us was to anticipate and respond, and Joe Toth is here, and he has a program that he's going to spend just a few seconds telling us about.
As quick as I can be, this is a group that we're sponsoring some talks having to do with the issue of home survivability in the wildfires, the inevitability of the wildfires around here. Very important topic, as we know that people in the area have lost homes to wildfire. It's going to happen in the future, so we're putting on some talks, and what else would you call that, Jan? We're having a film, Jack Cohen, that Phil talked about from the Fire Science Lab, retired, is going to talk about home survivability and what you can do and what you can do with your neighbors to make your home safe. We haven't, many of you are probably familiar with Molly. Our first is a Molly event that's happening on the night after next week's things. That's on March um, uh, the 7th. And then our next one is going to be at in Bonner at the Lutheran Church out in Bonner. That's on the 11th of March. And then the big one we're going to have is on the 21st of March at the Best Western Grant Creek Inn. All of these are free except for the Molly event. It's for Molly and their guests. We'd like you all to be guests to Molly. So come to those. They're all free. They're at various times. We have some information written down. You'll see posters and information coming out in the media about these. We invite anybody and all to come. Our first Molly event is going to be right here in this room. And we're going to have Jack talk, and we're going to have some stories about homes that have survived past wildfires and what those people did for mitigation, and then other information having to do with reverse 911, homeowners insurance, and a few topics like that. So we encourage everybody to spread the word, and you'll be seeing information out there in the media about these upcoming events.
Joe, will you be around and afterwards if people want to come up and talk with you? Super. So we'll do that. So questions. Who's got a question? Up there?
Hi, you said you'd get back to the blue coloring on your future fire prediction models.
Yes.
They all seem to be in the southern hemisphere.
Yes, and they were in the tropics in particular. So most of the land is in the northern hemisphere. The blue areas, so the areas where we expect fires to decrease, those are areas where aridity is going to lead to lower fuel availability. So you can imagine deserts expanding. Those are areas where we expect a decrease in fire activity, and that's where much of that blue was coming from.
Okay, thank you.
So in general, it is, at some point when we kind of realized that it wasn't all fire's going to increase everywhere, it is an important point that in some areas we expect fire to decrease, and largely that's because you're going to transition away from having a system that can support enough fuel to burn.
Just sort of a follow-on on that, she's kind of making my point, that lack of regeneration after severe fires, what do you predict for those landscapes? What kind of vegetation, if any at all, do you expect to see in those environments?
Great question. So that study was across all forest types, so low elevation to high elevation. Where we see that pattern most pronounced, as you would expect, is at low elevation forest. So lower tree line is where we'd expect that shift to occur first. So a lower tree line is where trees are at their warmer, drier end of their range already. So those are the systems where we'd expect fires to, or a lack of post-fire regeneration after future fire events. And in those cases, they'll transition from forest to non-forest, so forest to sagebrush, forest to grassland. At higher elevations, we'll see changes in forest structure. So there might still be trees there, but they'll be less dense than before. And ultimately, we expect to see changes in species composition as well. So the species that we see on the landscape today this is an oversimplification. They're not just going to march uphill, but we expect to see that the climate where they can grow is going to happen at a higher elevation. So that's part of the reorganization that we expect to see.
On the historic recovery after fires, how do you define recovery?
Great question, too. And I think in one version of this talk I had recovery in quotes. I don't know if I took that out or not. So we can define recovery we can define it quantitatively because when we have a time series. So we can define recovery as reaching the level of whatever metric we're looking at, reaching the level that it was before an individual fire event. So whether we're talking about like soil carbon or tree density, recovery would be when that came back to the level that it was before the fire event. That may, recovery may be different for a manager or for a citizen. If you say that the soil carbon is recovered, but you still don't have the trees you like to see there, then that doesn't matter. Right?
Phil?
Yes, I was just wondering, did you isolate out the human-caused fires? In other words, someone igniting the fire themselves from natural causes such as lightning and...
So that will vary among the studies that I referred to. Is there a particular point that you're thinking about, or?
Well, I guess my point is, what is the percentage of fires in the modern world right now that are ignited by humans on purpose or accidentally?
Okay, that's a more direct question, more complicated as well. So the answer to that will differ depending on what region we're in. And in the western U.S., the two contrasts, we're at one end of the contrast. So in the northern Rockies, the majority of area burned is still burned by lightning-ignited fires. In Southern California, that is the opposite. The majority of area burned in Southern California is from human-set fires. In the northern Rockies, I think the statistic is around like 35 to 40% of the area burned is from human-set fires, and the rest is from lightning-ignited fires. So even though the majority is from lightning-ignited fires, human-set fires are not negligible. 30% is significant. One of the points, depending on what study you look at, these links between climate and fire activity. Humans, we see this in Southern California, humans can extend the fire season. So whereas the typical fire season might be how many ever months, 4 months, particularly in Southern California, you see that humans extend that fire season by providing ignitions in periods where fuels are still receptible, but lightning wouldn't occur. So in that case, humans can extend the fire season. In cases like last summer, when conditions are extremely warm and dry, the correlation between fire and climate is going to pop out almost regardless of the ignition source. You're still going to have more area burned, whether it's human or lightning set.
So this is related. There were a couple of different graphs you had up on the historic fires. One question is, what was climate linked to the 1910 fire? And then the second one was, so there was a 1700 fire in Yellowstone, but there was not a dry year before that. What was that caused then?
Let me go to the 1910 one first.
Okay.
So 1910 is an interesting year. So this is 1910, and this is 1910. So let's see, is that like, it's still the third or fourth warmest spring on record? So 1910 is very consistent with warm, dry conditions during the summer, and in particularly that occurred in the spring. Interesting tidbit. 1910 was also a year of large avalanches in Stevens Pass, Washington, and Rogers Pass, British Columbia. The winter of 1910 was going along normally until early March, and then early March temperatures skyrocketed. That's part of what contributes to this, and that warming is also what led to those large avalanches. So 1910 it fits with the climate conditions that are typically associated with large fire years. The other thing in 1910 was a large wind event. When most of the area burned, it was during a large wind event. So we say that wildfires are large fires in large fire years are climate enabled and weather driven. So climate enabled means that you have these multi-month conditions that dry out fuels And then weather-driven means that you have the high winds that are needed to sustain rapid fire spread. So that's 1910. The 1700 one is more difficult to answer. I mean, the answer is we don't know what the climate conditions were there. I don't know if I'm going to be able to go back to that one. Here, yeah. So this is a good example of different. So our information on climate here is fuzzier than our information during the 20th century. And these bins these are like 15-year bins, and this is a tree ring reconstruction. So, which year were you looking at?
1700.
1700. Yeah. Why doesn't that fall in there? I mean, the answer is I don't know. Was 1700 a year that this area burned? Was it cool and wet? Pretty confident it was not cool and wet. So this could be that the tree ring reconstruction was off, or maybe this was the next driest year. So that's one reason why we have to go after this question with sample size. But good eye.
Hi, back here. So I learned something pretty shocking. It was the first question that was asked about the blue areas and your response that there's potentially less fuel to burn. And I know with a warming climate that we have more moisture in our atmosphere. And I guess my question goes back to where you stated, what do we have to look forward to? And it's a decrease in precipitation during the summer and an increase in other seasons. So am I right in kind of thinking that increase in the other seasons would be due to the extra moisture in the atmosphere? However, I guess the caveat is it doesn't matter if we have an increase in precipitation. I guess is it pretty much March through May that is the important months that determine our crazy fire years or in our region? I just kind of have, I guess, a little confusion around.
Okay, how to reconcile those. So well, I'll start with the general point that, well, first the general point, I'm not an atmospheric scientist, but in general, atmospheric scientists and climate modelers, it's most challenging to predict precipitation. However, what you started with, in general, if there's more energy in the atmosphere, that typically corresponds to more precipitation because there's more higher temperatures mean you can drive evaporation more. So if you just back of the envelope said you're going to increase temperature, you would expect more precipitation. Then the atmospheric science of it is where the jet stream is, how's seasonality going to change. So the models, how that works out that we don't expect that precipitation to be coming in the summer. So what does that mean for fire and vegetation? So we have to think about what vegetation sees and, in a way, what fire sees, what fuel does it need to burn. The growing season is when vegetation typically needs its moisture. And if there's not moisture available, either from precipitation or a snowpack, then it doesn't matter that it was rainy last December. Likewise, if the fuel was really wet in December, but it's dried out now in early June, mid-June, mid-July, that doesn't matter. So warmer temperatures in the summer and less precipitation in the summer are most likely going to lead to drier fuel conditions, and that's what corresponds with predictions of more fire activity. And likewise, that's what makes it more stressful for plants to grow or seedlings to establish.
So when you, excuse me, when you talk about about suppression and what we should come to expect, number one, I wouldn't want to be in your shoes because there's a no win to that, I think, as far as public perception. But I guess the question is, a lot of the fires, it sounds like, on the one hand, you folks would like to let them burn, let them use up that, the material that's on the ground. But on the other hand, you have to be careful not to let it get away from you and have a catastrophic event that could have been stopped. How do you reconcile that? How do you relate to the public where we think there's a good chance that this thing will peter out before it hurts too much, therefore we want to let it burn, and here's the safeguards we can put in place if it does start to get away from us?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's why I'm glad that I'm not a fire manager. I don't have to make those decisions, but that is the challenge. So let me zoom out and think about it more seriously. A lot of our challenge with living with wildfire is social and cultural. It's not like, I think we know the biophysical science well enough. So ultimately, I think the answer to your question comes down to changing culture and changing structures that have been long embedded in the systems that we have for managing wildfire. That's not easy, but that's what we're working to do, starting with, the next generation of fire managers. I think there's mounting evidence that quantifies the benefits that fires have for decreasing the likelihood of future fires. A lot of it being done by people in Missoula, scientists at the Forest Service. Sean Parks has a number of papers that looks at areas that are burned in wilderness and the probability of future fires occurring in footprints of past fires. And he's been able to pretty clearly document the decreased probability of wildfire occurring, the number of years that benefit lasts for, how that varies between different ecosystems, Northern Rockies versus Southern Rockies, for example. So I think with things like that, and hopefully with this recognition that we're not going to be able to, we've been trying to suppress fires for over 100 years now. And if you hear Jack Cohen speak, a statistic that he presents is that basically our success rate for fire suppression has not changed significantly over the last century plus, despite monstrous changes in technology, right? And that's because these 2% of fires that escape, those are the large fires that burn most of the landscape. So, not an answer. It's not easy, but I think it requires change a change in perspective and a change in culture. And interestingly, there's no place, I don't know that any culture has it yet, at least a Western culture. I can't say, look at Australia, look at Canada, look at Portugal. It's something that we're all struggling with.
Any other questions? Here's one.
This may be redundant because I was late getting here and I apologize.
Hold
Hold on just a sec, so everybody can hear. I can hear myself. This may be redundant, and I'm sorry I was a little bit late, not my fault. Would you please just list fuel treatments? Because it wasn't really defined that I could see or hear.
Oh, you're right. I did not define fuels treatments. And how many people were here last week? I believe Andrew spoke about fuels treatments. Yeah. Okay, so fuels treatments are manipulating vegetation. So think of you're familiar with the main corridor in the rattlesnake? You've seen the cutting that has happened up there? Okay, so that's one type of fuels treatment. So fuels treatments means removing vegetation from a portion of the landscape. And if you're a fire scientist or thinking about fires occurring, you call vegetation fuel. So fuels treatments are manipulating vegetation with some goal of changing the predicted fire behavior if and when that location burns. So the rattlesnake is an example of where they removed small diameter trees to change the likely fire behavior if and when the rattlesnake has an ignition.
This year, one of the more interesting, not not interesting fires, but a fire that occurred that kind of fits in with what you've been saying about the change in regeneration and the movement of the vegetation types as it becomes more dry, was the fire that occurred about in central Montana very early in the season. I think it was almost 200,000 acres was the largest fire I believe we had in the state of Montana this year.
Yeah,
And a lot of that was open country.
Yeah.
We've experienced some of those Billings out of bed fire 10 years ago or so, burned through that area. If you're predicting 10-degree changes, and you're going to see that much more of dry land areas that are in shrub or just grasses, how do you advise people in those locales? Those are places where they're just not used to the fires that we've seen in the Bitterroot and in the northwestern section of the state.
How do I advise them in terms of what to expect, or?
What to expect, and I mean, what potentially can they do to guard against those situations?
Yeah, that's a great question too, because, so linking to your question on fuels treatments, generally when we're talking about fuels treatments, we're thinking about modifying trees. So what do fuels treatments look like in those treeless landscapes? I'm not familiar with fuels treatments in those treeless landscapes. Kit, I'm going to look to you. Any?
Buffalo. Grasslands and things? Oh, I'm sorry. So in a lot of those areas, you're actually going to have to be relying on your road networks and other non-burnable surfaces. You can actually put in fuel breaks if you want to make sure that that fire doesn't get especially large. But you're right, it's a different beast. You're not trying to change the canopy height. You're not trying to alter the vertical structure of grasses. You're just trying to basically create non-burnable surfaces that when a fire burns, it'll stop if it needs to. Places where you'd be comfortable stopping a fire. Another thing to think about too is that typically the fire behavior is very different in a grassland or in a shrubland than what you would expect to see in a forest. You don't get 50-foot flame lengths in those areas. Oftentimes those are easier to contain except for when they get wind behind them, and sometimes grass fires can move much faster because those fuels are lighter. So it's a different beast, and you do have to treat it very differently.
You probably have a bigger window too in which you could do prescribed fire, just because there's the fuel smaller, it will dry out more quickly, it responds to the environment more quickly. So I would think that doing prescribed fire to take away the fuels could be more effective there.
I have a question. If we do all of this plan for fire and we're successful and we've embraced the shifts in ecosystems, what does the future look like for our kids or potential grandkids or down the road? It sounds like there's not much hope for having forests and trees like we know it today.
That's an awesome question. What does it look like if we do all this? So I don't think our future, I don't think we're not going to have forests in our future. So there will still be forests. There will still be trees. It won't look like the landscape that we've seen in the past several decades necessarily. There will be smoky summers like 2017. If we do all this, what I would see is that there would be a society that is building, planning with the inevitability of fire in the forefront, maybe analogous to the fact that if you live in Southern California or California in general, you have building codes that require you to plan for the inevitability of an earthquake. So we would recognize that fires are going to occur. We would plan accordingly. Your kids are going to be hiking around in a lot more burned forests. So if you've hiked in any of the burned forests in our neighborhood, in our neck of the woods, or in Yellowstone, your kids are going to have more opportunities to see forests like that. Going to be bird species that are happy about that, quote, quote. So different organisms will benefit from more fire. different organisms will not benefit. So there'll be winners and losers. One of the things that's most interesting to me to kind of wrap all this up, the perspective that I have from studying ecosystems over thousands of years, on the one hand, I'm impressed at how tough they seem to be. They go through a lot of stuff, and they still exist. Right? They look different. They have different species composition, but there's not a shutdown or total lack of life. So on the one hand, that gives me some hope that ecosystems are tough. They've taken a lot in the past, and hopefully they can take what we're throwing at them. On the other hand, it does mean that things are going to be different. So they might not have the same composition, they might not provide the same services that we've come to expect from them, but I think there'll still be trees there. They might be a little bit higher elevation, they might look different.
Thank you so much. I guess the takeaway from this is that although things are resilient, they do change. From this week and last week, I think the other takeaway is understanding fire that we've come to know in this last generation has been very interesting. And some of the most critical thinking and research that's been done on this topic has been done right here at the University of Montana, and we should all take some pride in that. Now that we've kind of gotten the picture of the inevitability of it, next week's lecture is going to talk about what we can do about it and what the effects on human health in an area where there's more wildfires or more severe wildfires than we've come to know. So plan on coming next week to hear about that. But now, please join me in thanking Professor Higuera for this wonderful talk. Thank you, Phil.
Thank you.